for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. With that, I'd like to turn the webcast over to Lee.
Thanks so much, Carol. So you're here today if you are interested in smartphone forensics. So I hope this kind of gives you that background information about our course that you're looking for. A little about myself. My name is Domenica Crognale. I go by Lee, so you may see them both ways if you are looking at social media or Twitter or even the SANS portal. But I am currently a cybersecurity engineer with Mantech. I'm exclusively working on mobile devices there. I'm also a course instructor and author for FOR585, and I've been authoring this course since its inception in 2014. I've also been involved in the InfoSec community and forensics for about 13 years now, and I've been exclusively dealing with mobile devices since probably around 2009. So you've probably happened upon this webinar because you were wondering if the FOR585 course is something you could be interested in. So who I think should attend this course? Well, obviously, if you find yourself in the digital forensics or incident response community doing examinations, this is probably a great course for you. You are probably not going to work in that environment without seeing a mobile device pass your desk at some point in time. But it's not just for forensic folks. Are you an application developer? Do you want to know the type of artifacts that your applications may leave behind on these devices and how they can be viewed in a forensic aspect after the fact? Are you someone that does security research? This class is great for getting into the devices to see how different interactions with applications such as malware can affect artifacts on the device. Are you an IT specialist? So do you work in a position that maybe has you provisioning devices and providing them to your employees? How should those devices be configured? Are there certain configurations that may actually hinder forensic examinations? We talk about that a lot in the course as well. And then are you someone that makes policy decisions? This is also a good class for someone to get the better understanding of what kind of information we can get from these devices and what kind of information we cannot get. So it's really a course that applies to many different fields. So a little about what we're going to cover today. This webcast was put together really with two common questions or feedback scenarios in mind. One of the most common questions we get from people are, is there something I should be doing to prepare myself for taking 585? It is one of the 500 level classes. It used to be called Advanced Mobile Device Forensics, and that probably scared a couple people away. It is not necessary that you have any prerequisites prior to taking the course, but it really does help if you have that foundational knowledge of forensics and forensic terminology before entering the class. And the other most common feedback that we probably get upon teaching this class is, why aren't we acquiring devices? I want to acquire phones. Well, you got what you asked for. I am going to acquire some phones today. But in addition to that, I will go over a little bit of the forensic terminology that may help someone that's kind of new to this field to get a grasp of some of the concepts that we mentioned throughout the course, so you feel like you're up to speed when you're entering the classroom on day one. I will show you some acquisition attempts on an Android and an iOS device, give you a little preview of forensic artifacts, and then lastly, walk you through the FOR585 SIFT workstation. So when it comes to device acquisition, there are many paid forensic tools out there. And if you take the course, you'll see that most of these are installed in your VM. Again, acquisition in a VM is not ideal, and I'll talk about some of those reasons when we get into the acquisition process, but they do a very good job of acquiring these devices. Your big heavy hitters like Celebrate and Axiom, Elcomsoft, they all provide ways to access data from these devices. There are many free options available as well. And one of the things we like to stress in this course is that we are completely vendor neutral. We supply you with a lot of vendor tools as well as free options in the chance that you may not have a budget that can support all of these different forensic platforms. So there are also free options for acquiring some of your devices. Obviously, these paid tools are paid for a reason. They do a really good job of getting data off of these hard to access phones. But some of those free options include things like sending commands to the device via the ADB bridge, the Android debug bridge to get data off of them. You can use something like iTunes, which is free for us, to get data off of our iPhones. And how does that data look when compared to an acquisition created with a forensic tool? These are some of the things that we discuss more in depth in class. So a little about the acquisition terminology. So you may have been told that a physical acquisition is the best way to go. And honestly, it is the most all-inclusive. But if that physical flash memory that you are trying to acquire is encrypted, it may not be your best bet. But what do we mean when we say physical acquisition? Well, this is a bit-by-bit copy of that flash memory. And that flash memory in our mobile devices is most often NAND or sometimes NOR flash. What it gives us is access to the full partitions on these mobile phones, being things like the system partition and the user partition, where most of our user-created artifacts are going to be stored. When we say file system acquisition, what are we talking about there? Well, when we think of this file system, that's our logical layout of how files are stored on these devices. When we are able to obtain a file system acquisition, we not only see where that data resides, but we actually also get access to the raw files themselves. And this is ideal. Then we have logical acquisitions. And really, these two, file system and logical, these two terms have kind of intertwined throughout the years. Sometimes when we were getting data from logical acquisitions, it may have implied that it just accessed data from files and then provided us the output when we weren't actually getting the raw files themselves. We'll see in 585 why having access to those raw files is so important to our investigations. And then lastly, but not least, there is the manual examination. And we've seen a trend, or we've seen it kind of take a cyclical approach where we used to do a lot of a manual examination back in the day. And then there was this wonderful period of time when our tools or our free solutions could provide full access, physical access to these devices. And now today we are seeing that sometimes the only solution is to manually go through the device as the user would and record, photo, or video that data. So some more acquisition terminology that you may have heard. So you may have heard when you're doing a physical acquisition that you may have to do a bootloader technique or a bootloader acquisition. So what exactly does that mean? Well, if you're on an iPhone and you are on an older iPhone, you may have been prompted to get your device into DFU mode, device firmware update mode. If you're on an Android device and you're attempting a physical acquisition via the bootloader technique, you may have to get the device into bootloader mode. And what exactly does this mean? Well, most often you will need to have your phone in an off state and then get your device into that mode so that before the OS actually boots up, we can inject a custom bootloader into memory. You also hear things related to Android like ADB mode. So what is the difference there? Well, ADB, the Android debug bridge, is the capability that allows us to communicate with our Android devices. This acquisition technique will require that USB debugging mode is enabled on the device. With that said, if the device comes to your desk already rooted, an ADB acquisition can be performed. If it is not rooted, however, your forensic tool or you as the examiner will need to root this device. Reason being, we want that unrestricted access to the file system, and in order to use ADB to get a physical acquisition of the device, it must be rooted. For iOS devices, you may have seen terms thrown out like quick method, full method, method 1, 2, and 3. And what do all of these mean? Just like in Android, if we want that unrestricted access to the file system, it is going to require that the device is jailbroken. Now, whether that happens outside with a third-party utility or tool that you may have access to where you work, or maybe the user has jailbroken that device, that is the way that we are going to get that unrestricted access to the file system. And then some other techniques or some terms that you may have seen if you use any of these forensic tools are things like agents and app downgrades. So when a tool references an agent, basically what they are saying is we are going to push a third-party application to this device in an attempt to pull more data from the file system. So it may require that you make certain modifications to that device itself in order to get that agent installed. And then lastly, that app downgrade. We talk a lot about in 585 why it may be necessary to downgrade versions of apps from a more current version to an older version that we were able to access more data from. All right, so here's what you've all been waiting for. Let's do some acquisition. So, in the spirit of doing a live demo, I thought that that was a very bad idea, so I went ahead and pre-recorded this for us. I said I was going to acquire a mobile device, and you'll notice that my USB drops off and reconnects here. And now, what is going on at the moment is it is saying, I want to try to identify this device. I gave you two options, and I selected the one that was my device. I can see here what kind of information I can get from a logical extraction. Calendar, SMS, some pictures. In a file system extraction, I get a little bit more data, which you can see in the right up here. And then a physical extraction, this gives most access to the data, and it also includes unallocated space in this example for this particular Android. So I'm going to choose physical. Now you can see I'm also presented with a lot of options like bootloader, where it attempts to insert a custom bootloader into memory before the device boots up. This forensic recovery partition, where it likes to make use of the recovery partition on the specific device to make alterations to the device in order to get root access to pull data off. And then the ADB extraction, where it's using the Android debug bridge to communicate with this device and pull data off. In this particular example, the device I had connected was already rooted by me, the user. So I'm selecting ADB. If it were not already rooted, at this point I would have to say, what firmware version am I running on this particular device? I know the device is already rooted, but I'm going to say, yes, it's above 412 and hit continue. Now, had it not be rooted, at this point, the forensic tool would try to root this device for me based on a lot of information in my build properties. From here, you'll notice that there are some things that it wants you to not touch on the device itself, like disregard any pop-ups. And once I said yes to that, the slow, painful, arduous process of getting a physical acquisition of your Android device takes place. Now, I am going to let it run here for a second, and while it's happening, I'm going to just mention that in our class, we do make use of a lot of forensic tools. And sometimes this is overwhelming to people new to mobile device forensics in general. As you start working in this field, you will notice that you will have some go-to tools for certain things. The tool that I am demoing in right now is Celebrate. So this is Celebrate's UFED for PC product, and I really like Celebrate a lot for its acquisition capabilities. It supports many, many devices, and it is very user-friendly, like you saw in those walkthroughs and prompts, and it allows you to really understand what is happening when you push that button. As far as other tools go, I like some of the tools like Oxygen for their really rich kind of additional browsing type support for different file types, as well as their search capabilities. I love Axiom for the way that it pre-analyzes data for us so that we don't have to dig through the file system for devices that we may have never analyzed before. It does a really, really rich, robust job of that. So you can see here, that's how long it took for the device to finally connect, and now my acquisition is underway. Now, in the lower portion here, I'm going to start a second video where I'm going to acquire from an iOS device. Now, notice I'm going to extract. And here it defaults to the logical, and that is the most common. But under physical, you can see what devices it will also support. But I know that this is a newer model device, and I have conveniently placed that video window over my UDID of my iPhone as I continue this process. It gives me the options for method 1 and method 2. You should choose both if you have the available time, but it will tell you which one is recommended. Once I select a location for that acquisition to be stored, I am on my way. One other thing I'd like to point out here about Celebrate in this particular example is that I'm using an older version of Celebrate's UFED physical analyzer. If you are acquiring an iOS 13 device, you must be on version 7.2.4. Of course, in the spirit of doing a live webcast, my Windows drivers were not playing nicely with my iPhone when I was trying to create this video. So keep that in mind. Be on the latest and greatest, which is 7.2.4, and acquire your iPhones if you're using Celebrate via the Physical Analyzer app. All right, so now we've acquired our devices. What do you get? Well, on the left here, you're looking at the physical output from both an Android and an iOS device. Whereas on the right, we are looking at the file system output of an Android and an iOS device. And I've purposely displayed them to you in 4 different forensic utilities. So I'm using 4 different forensic analysis platforms to show you this data. And they really are pretty much the same here, except for the different fancy icons that they're using to display the folders and such. But the main thing I'd like to point out here is that on the left, you will notice that we actually have access to those physical partitions on this device. In the Android, for example, at the very bottom there, you can see that user data partition. And that is the one that's going to contain the bulk of the user created artifacts that we are searching for. In addition, on that physical side there, and again, I'd like to point out that this is an older iOS device, and we do not have the luxury of pooling physical partitions from phones that are newer than iPhone 4s. However, this was just included to point out that under that system information there, you can see I have both the data and a system partition. And then over here on the file system, what's lacking is we don't have those physical partitions, but what we do have is an indicator of where that data came from. So while it doesn't say we have the full user data partition, I can see that it came from the data, user data partition, and it's now residing, this information is residing in the data directory. So a little bit more forensic terminology. So you may have heard people say, okay, let's get into the hex now. We've got our file system acquisition, and we've got our physical dump. Let's look at the hex. And lucky for us, most of these forensic utilities that we're using have built-in hex viewers. And they're very nice, and each of one of them does that a little differently, but it is always a good idea to take a look at that file in its hex view, just to make sure there are things that you may not be overlooking. So when I say hex view, what in the heck am I talking about? Well, first, let's start at the beginning. So to understand hex, I first want to talk a little bit about bits and bytes. So what is a bit or binary digit? Well, that's the smallest unit of data that we use in computers. And the value has to be one of two things. It's a 1 or it's a 0. So binary is based on the base 2 numbering system. And an 8-bit binary number can range anywhere from a value of 0 to a value of 255. Now, if you take 4 of those bits and put them together, that equals 1 nibble. And if you take 8 bits, that will equal 1 byte. So it's safe to say that half of a byte is also a nibble. So I have a question for you then. What decimal number am I trying to represent using the binary below? And I'll give you a few seconds to think about it. So if you pulled out your calculator and calculated 23, good job. If you have no idea how that happened, or you only know because of your calculator, I'll show you what I like to do when it comes to doing binary to decimal conversion. So like I mentioned, binary is a base 2 numbering system. So all of our base values here are 2. And then starting with that least significant value over there on the right-hand side, I increase the exponent by 1. Then I calculate that result. So 2 to the 0 power gives a value of 1, 2 to the first power, a value of 2, and so on. So now, in order to determine what that binary converts to, I can just plug in my binary values below. And now, that result of 23 should make more sense to you. So on to hex, just like we promised. Hex is a base 16 numbering system. So now we're using 16 different symbols to represent the numeric values 0 through 15. So the symbol 0 would represent the value 0. The symbol A represents the value 10. The symbol F represents the value 16. And then with that in mind, 1 byte, again, could range in value from anywhere between 00 to FF, where FF is equal to 255, just like we saw in that binary table in the slide before. And why is hex important to us? Well, one thing you will notice if you do have access to a physical acquisition is that your artifacts, so your files and folders, will point to a location, a source in the physical memory. And this is often referenced by the offset in hexadecimal. And now we'll talk a little bit about reverse nibbling and Endianness. So certain artifacts are stored in a reverse nibble format. And these artifacts usually apply to things like phone numbers or phone identifier related information. Now, while this isn't common on iOS and Android devices, it is a very common way for devices like Nokia, Symbian OS, and Chinese knockoffs to store data. So what does reverse nibbling actually mean? Well, it means when you're reading that data, you must read the least significant bit first. So in flash memory, this means that we are going to read the data on the right of that byte before we read the data on the left. So I put an example down below of a phone number in Hex. Now, if we knew that this particular operating system, let's say Nokia OS, stored all of its phone numbers reverse nibbled, then we could safely convert that phone number. And we would do this by taking the least significant bit from each byte and reading it first. So our bytes here are 7581763590. We simply read the least significant bit first in every case, so that changes our phone number to 571-867-5309. And kudos to anyone that recognizes that phone number. The next term that we may have to deal with is Endianness. And Endianness refers to the order of the bytes themselves. There is big endian, meaning that you read the most significant byte first, and little endian, where you read the least significant byte first. So we may find that artifacts like Bluetooth or MAC addresses are stored in a particular format. And if you aren't reading them in the proper order, you will be reporting that forensic artifact incorrectly. So in the example below, you're looking at a Bluetooth address in Hex. If we read that Bluetooth address, or if it was meant to be read in big endian, we would read that information from left to right. Whereas in little endian, we take the starting point at D8. So at byte D8, we begin reading our Bluetooth address and read it to the most significant value all the way through 1D. Notice that we aren't reversing the nibbles at all. The bytes remain intact. It's just the order that we are reading those complete bytes. And then that brings us to file carving. So what is file carving? Well, file carving is great, and a lot of your forensic tools will do this for you. They will usually pre-carve out things like images and videos and SQLite databases, and you're going to want them to carve out the SQLite for you if there's any SQLite to be found in there. And I just saw with Axiom's newest release, they've added KTX carving into their newest Axiom examine release. And if you don't know anything about KTX, you will after you take 585. And that's a big win for that tool there. But sometimes, even though these tools are really great at doing the carving, you still may have to manually carve for things. And reason being is, not every single file is carved out. Maybe it's a file that you just want to investigate yourself. Maybe it's not sitting someplace in an allocated space. Maybe there's some kind of proprietary file header or footer that kind of obscures or masks what that file really is, and it's not being carved out. So you may have to create keyword searches on your own to carve out specifically for file headers. So I've included a couple file headers below for you. Some of these are pretty common, so test yourself. Hopefully, some of these were easy to spot. And when all else fails, I like to plug my file header into my trusty Google search engine and see what kind of results I get. Okay, so that brings us to the SIFT workstation. So hopefully you all can see that I just switched into my SIFT VM. And you can see all of the different tools that we have pre-installed for you. So we will use, your big forensic acquisition utilities like our UFED for PC. We use Axiom Process to process forensic images that we've got from Acquire. We also have the Oxygen Forensic Suite, which allows for acquisition of items as well. One thing I would like to point out, if you are taking this class and you have all of these really great robust tools inside your VM, if you're attempting physical acquisitions, you may realize that you have some problems, and that's because they usually require that the phone turns off or reboots, and then your device, when it reconnects, it may want to reconnect to your host machine, and it kind of interrupts that process. So something to consider. But all of these tools that we have licensed in your VM, play around with them. They're licensed from anywhere between 30 and 90 days, and they're all really good resources to get your feet wet with the acquisition process. And while we do not acquire in class, feel free to bring your devices to any class that you take with us, and I'm sure myself or the other instructors will be happy to assist you with your acquisition questions and concerns during breaks or lunches or any available time after class. But most of this course is going to be spent doing the analysis. We are going to get into these devices and really try to interpret what these artifacts mean. All of our cases or case files are contained nicely on a separate case drive where they are separated out per lab per day. In addition to that, we also have a really nice collection of scripts for class that we are sharing with everyone. And these are those free scripts. So most of them are written in Python, but free scripts to go through and do things for you that a lot of your forensic tools may do as well, or maybe it fills in some gaps where things are missing. So another really nice bonus in your VM here. So what to expect when you come into class on day one? Well, we start out with a brief overview of smartphones in general. So we will try to go through a lot of the common terminology and best practices for handling these devices. And day one, it's really jam-packed. So we don't spend a ton of time getting you up to speed with everything under the sun about mobile devices, but we want you to feel comfortable once we get into the actual hands-on portion. We will introduce several tools so that you can start to become more comfortable playing around and navigating the file system in these forensic utilities. And again, because we offer so many different platforms for you to utilize, stick with what you're comfortable with, or if you want to challenge yourself and go outside the comfort zone, there's definitely a tool out there for you to use. We do a really deep dive into the Android file system on day 2, and we do a similar deep dive into iOS on day 3. If you're interested in hunting down malware on devices, you will really enjoy day 4. So day 4, we attempt to find potential malware on a device, and then once we've narrowed that malware down, we actually analyze the app itself to see its intended purpose, to see if we really think that this application was developed to be malicious in nature. And then we kind of culminate the week in day 5 with third-party application analysis all day long. So we talk about similarities in some of the different types of third-party applications, where they store their data, how they store their data, what type of files they typically like to use to store data, and where that data typically resides. And if you are lucky enough to stick around for the 6th day of the course, it's really the most fun. One of the really good suggestions that we've gotten from students in the past are things like, I really wish that each day could build, one entire case, from start to finish. As far as our labs go, well, that's what you're getting if you stay for day 6. So you are presented with a collection of devices and you are left to complete your investigation. It's a lot of fun, and it allows you to apply a lot of the different techniques. It allows you to look in a lot of the different places for data that maybe your forensic utilities don't immediately point you towards, but that you will be able to find after sitting through this week-long course. We also have 19 hands-on labs in addition to that capstone, And we have some take-home and bonus stuff. So when we retire old operating systems from the course material, they stick with us. We don't want you to miss out on that knowledge because you never know what type of phone will come across your desk. I have seen phones that I would have never expected to see before in my life. So I'm glad that I never said, you know what, that doesn't apply to me. I don't care about Blackberries. I'm never going to see one. I would have been out of a job if I said that in particular, because I was working at a place that dealt specifically with BlackBerry devices. So there's a device out there for everyone, and there's plenty of practice material and image files to play around with as well. So a little bit about the class itself. We launched the course in 2014. It's been through many, many iterations since that time. Like I said, we have retired the old material, but we still make it available to the students, so you can still complete the labs and go through the course material that used to be included. We do have a GAC certification available, the GASF, if you're interested in a certification. Even if you don't plan to get the cert, you will get those 36 CPE credits for attending. And this is also one of the courses that are included in the SANS Master's program, if that's something that you are involved with. Again, this course was co-authored by myself and lead author Heather Mahalik, and we've been working on it since 2014. It's kind of our baby. We want to address some of the hard to tackle problems like encryption and parsing and query drafting and malware analysis. So things that we really think every forensic examiner is going to see in the field. One other thing I'd like to point out is that after taking the course, we do invite all of our attendees to join our alumni Google group. It is probably one of the best resources, in my opinion, out there as far as bouncing questions off of other examiners in the community. We really like to kind of foster that idea of, sharing information back and forth, share successes, share failures, so we don't try to recreate the wheel every time we take a look at a new device. I've learned so many things by some of my fellow students in the community, and I really, really thank people for their contributions there. So it's really, really worth its weight in gold. If you are law enforcement, make sure to reach out after this webcast. We do offer a 50% LE discount for certain seats if available, and that includes online training as well. All right, so hopefully you found your interest was piqued. So if you were on the fence about taking 585 before, hopefully that got you kind of a background of what you may see. If you're interested in taking the class with me, my last class will be in Paris in December. But I'm also teaching again in California and in London in the 2020 new year. If one of these classes, and these all still have available seats, if one of these classes just doesn't fit because it doesn't fit into your location or travel schedule, I would like to point out that our class in December in Washington, D.C. has the simulcast option available. And if you've never taken simulcast before, or if you don't know what simulcast is, it's wonderful. You can actually attend the class while it's live in session. So depending on where you are in the world, you may have to attend it from your pajamas, but you will be logging in and listening to the class along with your fellow students who are sitting live in Washington, D.C. So it's a really great option if you can't make any of these locations work for you. And then lastly, if you want more information about the course, I've included our course link below. It will give you some really detailed information as far as what to expect each day, as well as some vital information about the proper configuration and capacity of that laptop you bring with you on day one. It is a very large VM, so we're going to need a lot of space. But all of that information is outlined in that course page. So with that, I open it up to any questions you may have for me, and I really do appreciate your attendance today.
All right, thanks, Lee, for that great presentation. We do have a couple of questions ready for the Q&A. However, if anyone has a question for Lee, please enter it into the questions window now. Our first one asks, are your acquisitions assuming that as the investigator you have the PIN code, etc., to unlock it? I assume you need that in order to put it in debug mode, etc.
So the acquisition that I created for you today, for this particular model phone, what you may not have seen as I kind of went through the options, that particular phone did have an option for password bypass or lock bypass. So in that case, we may have been able to bypass that lock altogether. It again was an older Android Samsung device that I was acquiring, and I never gave it the passcode when I did that acquisition. But you are correct in assuming that I did already have USB debugging mode turned on that particular device, and as I mentioned before, it was also rooted, which was why I was able to do that ADB acquisition.
All right, thank you. In the class, do you also address files sync across devices? Windows and Apple both allow sync data between phones and computer. Do you discuss identifying where the file was created? For example, which device was the one where it was first written to? I know that's rather long, Lee, so I can repeat it if necessary.
No, that's perfectly fine. So we actually do discuss different concepts related to syncing. We talk about some of the different iCloud sync settings that you may be interested in, as well as different browsers that are syncing, and things like third-party applications where you can use a desktop application versus a mobile version of that application. So these are addressed in class. There are sometimes scenarios where it is not going to be possible to tell where that artifact was created, but we also discuss that information as well. But you should kind of get most of those questions answered during class. And of course, if you have a specific scenario where that kind of data or that scenario applies, we can certainly walk through it.
All right, thanks. Can you talk about SIFT's tool to help actually analyze the data?
Sure. So I'll actually step back into my VM quickly. So in our SIFT workstation, we have multiple tools here that will be that analysis platform when it comes to analyzing the data. I showed you phone acquisitions when I gave you that output of the file system. I displayed them in Oxygen, which you'll see here. I displayed it in Autopsy. I displayed one in Axiom Examine, and I displayed another one in Physical Analyzer. So all those platforms that I just mentioned there, we will use during class to do our forensic analysis. Those are our analysis platforms, and that's really where we spend the bulk of our time. I didn't show you Blacklight, but we use that one, and we have it fully licensed as well for you to use in class.
All right, thank you. How much of the course material is related to the certification?
Very good question. So when you take that GX cert, one thing to keep in mind is it must be written down in that book for it to be a valid question that they can ask you on that certification. Heather and I have been doing mobile device forensics for a long time, so sometimes we find ourselves kind of giving some of our own background and scenarios related to things that we've experienced or some hurdles that we've had to overcome while we're teaching the course. That stuff that I am talking about that's not written in your book is not testable. So if you ask me a one-off question and we get down to, and we all decide to take a look at a file, and I bring it up on the screen and it's not something written in the book, not testable. So that's really nice. You are allowed to take your books or any printed material into those certification testing centers with you. So we offer forensic posters. We offer cheat sheets for all of the different operating systems that we discuss. And then, of course, you can bring your course books along.
Thanks, Lee. Would you prefer open source tools or commercial tools?
Ooh, another really good question. You know what? One thing I live or die by is that you should not put all of your trust into one tool. I like a little bit of everything. In one of my past positions, I was doing a lot of third-party application research. It involved writing SQLite queries to just get data that I cared about from particular databases. I did most of that in a completely free non-forensic tool because I was really caring about, what data is of interest to me. How do I write that query language? And it was quick and it was easy and it wasn't forensic. All of your forensic platforms offer that same capability to generate a SQLite query as well. One thing I would stress is to always use a second backup tool. If you find something, and let's say it's the crux of your investigation, the smoking gun, I would always take a look at that same data, whether it's a database or a picture or a video file, in another tool just to verify. Nobody's perfect. The people that develop these tools are human too. They're wonderful for what they do, but sometimes from version to version they may completely lose a capability that they had 2 versions prior. And one of the things that's hard to stress to people is if you will work in an environment where you're looking at phone after phone every day, it's kind of difficult to notice where that data is missing. It's easier to notice that your tool missed something if you're looking at data that's very personal to you. And by personal, I mean get out your own phone, make an acquisition every once in a while. If it's your iPhone, use iTunes if you want to. But do an acquisition. You know what you did on that phone. You know what data you expect to find, so make sure it's there. And we talk about that a lot in class too, like how to create a testing environment so you know every time that you're getting the results you expect to see.
All right, thanks. How credible would you say is forensic analysis using an open source tool in court?
Ooh, well, that one I'm kind of, I may have to steer clear of that one for a little bit. I actually have not had to testify, thank goodness. Based on some of the places I've worked, I was unable to testify. However, I believe if you could recreate the scenario in a way to say that, here is my test device with data set X, and I ran through the process on it, and you were able to compare, the results of that testing to what you were getting off of your, suspect device, that they would be able to, to accept, that output in court. I know that a lot of these tools have very close ties with, the law enforcement community, and they're very trusted and respected. So if if that's the route that you're going, you probably would save yourself a little heartache with going with one of these trusted vendors in that regard. But there's no reason that you shouldn't be able to recreate that same information in your free tool as well.
All right, Lee, well, that's all the questions we've had submitted. Thank you so much for your great presentation, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.